So a concern that's been coming up more and more is how to train in spite of specific kinds of back pain, right? So one of the more common forms of back pain is something called discogenic back pain. Without getting too deep into what that is, the broad stroke of it is something like there's an injury or instability around the intervertebral discs of the lumbar spine, or sometimes even the T-spine. And when there's a movement challenge, it causes these little micro translations and twists and turns that the back isn't used to. It causes pain, sometimes even pinching off a nerve. The good thing about discogenic back pain, which, just to be clear, is different from having a ruptured or herniated disc, is that, the vast majority of the time, that stuff is treatable with exercise. Manual therapy, massage, manipulation, good training, adjusted exercise. This is something that you rehab, not cut. So a common question is, how do I train? How do I keep my level of fitness in the context of having to deal with that injury? Or how do I train in such a way that facilitates that rehab? And that's kind of what I'm giving here. We're going to start with a cat-camel drill. The cat-camel drill is going to transition to a bird-dog drill. I'm fully aware these are a bunch of animal names, right? Cat, camel, bird, dog. From there, we're going to apply some of the core drills that we're learning in those two positions to increasingly difficult positions, specifically to the kettlebell deadlift, and then eventually the kettlebell swing. Okay. The very first thing we're going to do is some breath work. The way that starts is, I want you to envision between your rib cage and your pelvis a rope. Okay? You're going to take a deep breath into your pelvis. And as you exhale, I want you to exhale through gritted teeth to make that hissing noise. And as you breathe out, I want you to imagine like a string getting pulled tight, drawing your xiphoid process, that's the middle part of your front ribs here, down to your pubic bone and vice versa. If you watch my hands here, what ends up happening is I breathe in. As I breathe out, a slight tuck. The reason that's important is because you want to create that core stability, because that's one of the things that prevents that micro translation, micro twists in the discs that causes a lot of the pinch nerve pain. One of the things to practice as you establish that is, can you breathe without breaking that tension? One of the ways you practice this in person is something like you take a deep breath in, exhale, get tight, and have somebody gently hit rack against the belly to make sure that as you're doing this, it doesn't disrupt your breath, as opposed to knocking the wind out of you. You can do that for one more rep. One of the ways you can test if your core is braced correctly is that you have all this stability, all that stiffness, but you can still speak. The reason I bring that up is later on when we start lifting the kettlebell, there's going to come a phase where we reinforce the breath a second time in spite of that brace, and now you can't speak because not only is your brace tight, but it's tight because of the muscle action and filled with air. We'll get to that later. One more rep. Nice and loose. Nice and tight. Hold that for a few seconds. Make sure you feel the engagement across the abdomen, not just in the front. Release that tension and then get onto the hands and knees. Elbows and knees if you need to for the next drill. This movement, the cat-camel or cat-cow drill, it's meant to be done softly, supplely. We're not going to push for end ranges. We're not trying to feel any tightness or burn at the end ranges of the motion. What's going to happen is we have two positions. Position one, in which I'm going to arch my back, and position two, in which I'm going to dip my spine down. And if you notice, my head moves along because my neck is part of my spine. The way it works is, on the cat phase, I'm going to try to dip my pelvis down, bring my belly button, sink it to the ground, bring my head up. On the cow or camel phase, I'm going to take that same point and try to draw it up towards the ceiling, feeling out those endpoints. This drill functions as lubrication for those discs, and a brief mobilization drill to get those discs ready for the broader work so that you don't hurt yourself. Again, for those with discogenic pain, a lot of this movement prep is designed to let you train unencumbered. For those without these issues, this may not be necessary. Again, context matters. Why would I do this type of warm-up? It's because I have a disc that I care about, theoretically. As you start to warm up, you can move between the two positions a bit more vigorously. Depending on where you feel your issues, you can also do the same drill. Instead of going ceiling to floor, you can also modify it to go from side to side, focusing the bend on what matters for you. This is something to feel out as an individual versus to do prescribed. Everybody's gonna be a little bit different. I've even seen some folks do like circles with their back, and now I'm like, that's cool. I don't know if I have an application for that myself. On the last rep of your cat camel drill, you're going to apply the breath hold we just did standing to the final position. What do I mean by that? What you're gonna do is you're gonna go into the cow/camel phase. You're going to sink down into the cat phase. Take a deep breath in. Exhale tight. And notice that that exhalation pulls you into what should be a relatively flat back position or neutral back position. From here, we're going to transition to the next drill, the bird dog drill. Now you can do this with your arms up on your elbows. It just depends on leverage and what you want to do. I'm going to do it for my elbows just because it's easier to speak in this position. While keeping my core tight, the goal is to be able to extend one leg and the opposite side arm without a lot of wobbling and twist. Same thing on the other side. For some of you, this might be perfectly fine. For some of you, this might be difficult. For some of you, this might be painful. And the reason I call that out is if the basic movement is fine, then you're doing this for reps, right? Give me maybe 5 to 8 reps per set times 2 sets to warm up and move on. However, if that's difficult for you, if that's painful for you especially, you're going to do something called a regression. That means you're going to do the same basic concept of movement, but take some of the difficulty down somehow. Your options are using the legs only, using the arms only, or walking into your setup, as in I'm going to bring out my leg first, and then my arm, versus doing it all at once. The purpose of this drill is to add some torque across your back for you to manage, and the amount of torque is a function of how much leverage you have, right? Tell me that both arm and leg are out, and it's a wide angle, that's a lot more torque than straight ahead, versus just an arm, versus just a leg. Okay. Once that's done, we have one more warm up for the hips, and then we're going to move on to the kettlebell side. So this is where we're going to do something called a 90-90 drill. I realized I forgot to mention that in the opening of this video. The way the 90-90 works is you're going to create a series of 90-degree angles. So watch my toe to my ankle to my knee, that's 90. Ankle, knee, hip, that's 90. Leg to my other leg, through my pelvis, that's 90, etc., etc. Now I have this 90-degree structure. For the sake of this drill, what you're going to practice doing, you can use your hands as support, is move from one position, left side, to the other position, right side. And you're going to work on doing that back and forth. This has an effect on some of the muscles in the groin area that pull into your back. This should take tension down in the spine. The way you're going to practice this, especially if this is comfortable, is you're going to apply the same bracing technique we used before into an extra movement called a hip extension. I'm going to exaggerate the breath. And if you notice, I'm inhaling on the transition, placing my hips in position, and then I'm exhaling while I use my glutes to drive this open. I'm going to isolate the next rep to demonstrate something. In this top position, I'm clenching my glutes as hard as I can, more so my left and my right. By clenching my glutes, I'm taking this interesting neurologic property called reciprocal inhibition, and I'm using the tension in my glutes to shut down some of the tension in the front of my quads and adductors. That's an important thing because traditionally, from an osteopathic perspective, we'd be treating tight hip flexors, tight adductors with something called counter strain as a warm-up. Because you're trying to do this on your own without somebody there warming up for you, right? This drill, this switching 90-90 with a hip extension, this functions as a somewhat equivalent of that counter strain technique, simply self-applied. Once the hips feel supple, once the core feels engaged, there should be a little bit of increase in heart rate. We can start working with this bell. Let's put that right here. At this point, I'm going to talk about the technique for the kettlebell deadlift and kind of walk our way into the kettlebell swing, knowing that depending on where you are as a trainee, you're either going to stop here or move on to the next part. Again, a lot of this is modular on purpose. The kettlebell swing technique is built off of a hinge. What is a hinge? So, what's going to happen with this drill, okay, just demonstrate an idea. You take a long stick, you put it on top of your head, back of your ribs, top of your sacrum, that's your butt. And what you want to learn how to do is push your hips back, push your butt back behind you, bend the knees a little bit without collapsing your spine or arching your back. So I want to maintain firm contact, point 1, 2, 3, push my hips back until I'm low enough to grab onto the bell. Part of what makes this work is that bracing technique we discussed earlier. So you take a deep breath in, create a little bit of core tension. How much is a function of how stiff your back is. And once you have some stiffness, push those hips back, hinge, and reverse the movement. Everything we're about to do is this technique applied to more and more strenuous environments. For example, for those who are about to deadlift. What you then do is line up the handle of the bell with your shins, make a little bit of space, tighten the core, push the hips back, hands on bells, squeeze it like it owes you something, reverse the movement, and put it back down. For some of you, that's the technique, right? And that's the level of training. You start here, create space in your hips, brace, so on and so forth for reps. Typically, again, shooting for 5 to 8 reps per set times 3 to 5 sets. For those of you where the deadlift technique is adequate, now we'll define adequate as easy and it doesn't hurt. This is not meant to be the training in and of itself. If you're just going to train your deadlifts, which is great, use something heavier, perhaps even use a barbell. That being said, this deadlift technique is meant as a gut check to make sure you're safe for your swing technique. So let's say your deadlift is good. The difference now is what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my toe, big toe, with the back of the bell. So I'm behind it a little bit now. Turn my feet out, turn my heels out, create that stable base, brace my core, push my hips back and hands on bells. Now if you notice, with the deadlift, my center of gravity was lined up with the bell. Now there's a pendulum. And what I'm going to do is that. Now how do we make that happen? That's where we're going to spend the remainder of this video. Set up behind the bell, turn out, okay? Brace your core, push your hips back. Let's start with just learning how to pull your scapula back to let the bell swing between your legs. As I tilt my pelvis back, what's going to initiate the movement is I'm going to brace my scapula with enough pressure to clear the weight, right? Just getting used to that penduluming motion. This might also be referred to as a silverback drill for gorilla reasons. What I want to make sure of is as I'm penduluming the bell back and forth, the tension, the load, is on my hamstrings and my glutes as opposed to my quads. If I do this too squat-like, I feel it here. And that's a problem because these muscles here pull into those things back here. And in the right context, that's great. In this context, remember, disc pain, that's a problem. I want the tension loaded on my hamstrings and my butt muscles, the glutes, not my adductors and quads. Hence, I'm using a more hinge dominant technique as opposed to a squat dominant technique. Neither is wrong. It's what are you trying to accomplish? So I'm going to mess with that pendulum. Until I'm confident I figure out the ratio of knee to hip that gets all the load right about here for me. And for me, that's about here. I'm going to pendulum once or twice. The way I make this swing happen is I'm going to snap my hips forward with enough force to projectile the bell. You can think of it as throwing, right? But instead of letting go, I'm going to hold on because my garage and my car are there. And that's a bad idea. What's going to happen is, as long as I'm holding on to this bell and I snap my hips with enough force, I end up creating a longer pendulum arc. The idea is to swing the bell to roughly chest, neck level. Again, what's the setup? Great toe touching the back of the bell, okay? That way you know your center of gravity is where it needs to be. Turn your feet out. That should give you a marker of how far you need to be to clear your hips. Turn your heels out, and now space, okay? Take a deep breath in. Exhale tight, push my hips back. Hands on bell, squeeze it like it owes you something. When I fire my scapula and brace my shoulders and my upper back, I'm going to lean back just a tad to initiate the pendulum. Once I'm confident that my pendulum is doing what I want it to do, I'll transition to swings. And the idea being that if you hear the breath pattern, as I'm hinging up, I'm placing that core bracing technique right where the impulse is highest to protect my spine and translate that energy forward. It's the breath at the top is to make sure that I'm taking a moment to breathe, right? Because you can imagine with enough stress, you're just going and you pass out. Don't do that. 1, 2, 3. The deliberate counting helps make sure that you're exhaling so that you remember to breathe on the way down. Typically, what we'll do is build up to 10 sets of 10, knowing that in the start, it might be best off doing maybe 2 to 3 reps per set times 10 sets, as in keep the 10 set total, but play with the rep count per set first. So we'll do 10 sets. Maybe for the first time you do this, you'll do 3 reps per set. And then every session you add a rep, or add a rep to each set. You get the idea, progress accordingly. But I want to get into the habit of doing 10 sets and then add complexity within those 10 sets, add progression within those 10 sets. What does that look like? That's a consistent technique. Get comfortable with that setup, right? Toes, turn out, okay? Push the hips back, get tension along the hams and glutes. I'm gonna skip the pendulum this time. I'm gonna brace the top of my core. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Things to note. Although my grip is active, my arms, my shoulders are actually really passive in this drill. I'm not doing an assisted fly, right? My arms are essentially just rope tethers keeping this thing from flying out of place. In fact, let's see if I have a setup for this here. Yeah, we can do that. This is a resistance band, just to demonstrate the principle. To really isolate this difference between a shoulder dominant front raise technique versus me basically just swinging my arms forward using the momentum of my hips, I'm going to thread this resistance band through the handle, okay? If I were to use my shoulders, looks clunky, feels clunky, it's a front raise. A bad front raise. Do not do that. Just do a real front raise. However, if my arms are just along for the ride and I use my hips, it actually doesn't look that different from the normal technique. Keep that in mind. Again, the work is coming from your glutes, your core, your pelvis. Your hands are holding onto the weight so it doesn't fly, and your shoulders are really just there to steer, but I'm not lifting with these. Does that make sense? Good. The idea is that by first mobilizing the core, the spine with the cat, camel, and bird dog, reinforcing that, getting the adductors out the way with that 90-90 with the extension, and then reinforcing that with the deadlift to pendulum, the kettlebell swing progression. We're building the skills to create stability in the core instinctually. Because one of the really cool benefits of something like kettlebell swing is they're fast, which means I need to be able to really carefully control how much tension and how much suppleness I'm putting into my spine as I navigate the weight under increasingly dynamic conditions. The ability to dynamically dial up and down tension without overclocking it and oversteering it, that's a lot of what makes this back pain less so. In fact, for a lot of my guys, when they injure their backs, this is something like the rehab, specific details pending their actual injuries. But the template looks something like this. And that's what we have. Have fun.